In fiction, characters can be divided by whether they undergo change or not. Dynamic characters are those that change over the course of a story, and static characters are ones who stay the same. Change is an important aspect in writing a protagonist, in my humble opinion, because the effects events or interactions have upon a character are a good way of getting people invested in the people whom your story is centered on, as well as a great way of demonstrating stakes and consequences. Often, characters start off as imperfect and are challenged by the events of the story to look at themselves and maybe abandon something that's holding them back. Whether this imperfection is merely a skill issue or a mentality or personality issue should be up to the writer, but most often the best characters are the ones who grow in ways more than just their skill or level of ability. This is why having a fundamental flaw is so important to making characters, because the more flawed a character is, provided he isn't so flawed that he becomes repulsive or you have some other means of keeping people invested, the better payoff you potentially have when that character overcomes their own negative aspects. That's why I think it's a shame that people will just look at the surface and label Rudy a pervert and move on, or label Subaru a simp and not look at everything that built up to that behavior while also ignoring the overwhelmingly positive side of him. And part of that is how shallow people have become. They see the surface level or a singular thing they don't like and form a judgment about these characters, then cement that in their minds as what the character is and don't think much deeper about what brought those behaviors about or how the character actually changes in motivation or personality across the series. In the case of Rudius, it's usually vindictiveness or some sort of moral grandstanding. Most of the time I find people leveling accusations against the character without actually delving into the details of what happened to him and what the small nuances of a situation were. They also like to ignore that he comes to acknowledge himself as being flawed. They fail to see that Rudy being a degenerate is something for him to overcome, and anything short of him having to suffer torment and hailfire will not do it for them when it comes to the character's growth, which honestly seems terribly vindictive and self-righteous if you ask me. With Subaru, it's generally just frustration at his antics and finding the character annoying, or the misguided concept that he is solely emotionally frail or immature. And okay, let's just put it this way, this dude's a teenager facing deadly and tormenting situations nobody should have to face in their lifetime, much less multiple times. If the dude breaks down, I can't say I blame him because I'd certainly fold under the same circumstances. But I get the annoyance of it all. It's hard to watch someone make such obvious self-aggrandizing statements like he does in the Capitol without realizing how he sounds. Honestly, he'd probably have been so much less annoying to me during my first run through of the series if I hadn't been able to relate to him so much in his struggles. I cringed at so much of the stuff he does because, well, it reminded me of some of my own behavior to some extent, and I really don't want to relive my most embarrassing moments. I've been to the point of acting out because I thought that would be my place in life. I've done the whole look how goofy and fun I am even though inside I'm suffering thing. I've been through that need to find a place to fit in or belong that makes you act cringe and try to make people like you. I've tried to bear the burdens of my own problems all on my own because I don't want to be a problem for anyone else. I understand how after living in that state of mind for so long, you can fail to realize that though you may have actually had good intentions to do good things at the forefront of your mind, there's a part of you still seeking the validation of doing the good thing. And people, again, will only observe the surface level of the character and not really think any deeper or analyze everything that's going on with this character. And like I said, I think it's a shame. It would be like reading a parable and taking it at face value, because it's also worth noting there are positive values in each of these characters. For Subaru, it should be blatantly obvious, regardless of the subconscious motives he may have and the things that have pushed him to where he is. And yes, I say subconscious because he's largely unaware of his own desire to prove himself until he is told that he behaves like someone seeking validation. He's still someone with largely good intentions and a good heart. Regardless of the outwardly appearance of his actions, Subaru still values others very deeply, is willing to put himself in harm's way to save them, and is genuinely a caring person. All 100% dignified qualities. It's just that, at the root of a lot of it, there is that childlike desperation to prove himself worthy of others, because he became convinced at some point that his life only held value because of what he could do or how special he could be. With Rudy, we get several small things, like a strong sense of justice towards bullying, which is derived from the torment he experienced in his first life, and some sense of being willing to bend the rules a bit in order to save someone's life, like when he blames Paul for the affair when it was Lelia who seduced the man and not the other way around. Aside from his perversion, Rudy's an otherwise normal person. I don't dare say decent morals due to his proclivities, but a clear moral lean away from complete corruption. He has one major negative downside, and everything else about him is normal or good. All that said, he still has a strong dedication to his family that, even though he has some glaringly negative traits, still makes him an okay man in one way or another. Growth is an important part of making a protagonist that people will like or relate to, starting with a so-called fatal flaw and growing them out of it slowly, or providing a chance for them to completely overcome it, has the power to really make people like a character. Overcoming adversity, even small personal adversities, makes a character human and far more relatable to the audience. We like to fantasize about facing and overcoming adversity ourselves, so there's something inherently endearing about our favorite fictional characters doing just that. People seem to relate more to others who struggle the same way that they do, for better or for worse, than those who share positive qualities or similar interests. The idea of a shared burden or struggle brings people together, and I imagine that most of us like to believe in our ability to overcome those struggles and prove ourselves stronger than the things holding us back. If only everyone was like that. So without development, characters become flat. They lose the essential part of being human, that is trying to overcome your own weaknesses, especially when they have some glaringly dissuasive issues that never change. The case of Takemichi Hanagaki is an excellent example of a flat main character who never overcomes the biggest problem he has. Takemichi is the same archetype of protagonist as Subaru Natsuki, the low-powered MC who can't do much aside from use his meager ability to manipulate events to try and steer things in a certain direction. But the main difference is that Takemichi never has his get smart or get strong moment, and never gets called out for being a spineless, do-nothing wimp. And because of that, he's largely viewed as the worst part of his own series by everyone who I've talked to about Tokyo Revengers. He lacks an aspirational or inspirational quality that is desirable enough to outshine his weaknesses. I mean, nobody wants to be the guy who just sits there and cries for someone else to fight his battles. And the combination of the fact that he sucks as a character to begin with, and the fact that he never grows out of it, places him soundly at the top of the list of underdeveloped protagonists. And if I'm saying that after all the isekai I've watched, you really gotta suck as a character. In almost perfect contrast, Subaru gets his bluff called in Arc 3 by quite a few people, forcing him to confront his own insecurities and ultimately grow out of them. He has to acknowledge that his pride should come second, and that just because he can try to jump in and help doesn't mean he actually is helping. In fact, by letting his pride and quote-unquote sense of justice dictate his actions, he ends up doing more harm than good. Julius, Amelia, Wilhelm, and many others all point out that Subaru is the one in the wrong during his capital visit, but ego and desperation blind him to the point of repeating the same mistake over and over again until it mentally breaks him, and it's an excellently written arc. Of course, this requires your character to start off in a state that isn't perfect, or at least be able to acknowledge weakness where it lies at one point or another. And that is a risk in and of itself, because negative qualities can be a huge turnoff if not handled or done correctly. You're not going to see a bunch of people sympathizing with a murderer just because the fact that the development of the two characters I've discussed is so precise and thought out is what makes them so remarkable in my mind. You can trace the path of their development and look at the details of every situation and really get into the weeds about how it all ties together. It's a compilation of loads of little details and small mental self-checks that slowly develop a character into the point where they can finally make a choice on the matter of changing themselves. Subaru is a bit more dramatic, if you ask me. It builds up the stress of failure upon failure until ultimately there's nowhere for the pent-up pain to go, and then opens the floodgates for a resolution in his character that totally reverses the situation. See episodes From Zero and Parent and Child if you want to know what I'm talking about. And this is very much in line with how Tabe Nagatsuki likes to write things. He loves to build things up to the highest highs and then drop them off a cliff into the abyss and start all over again. It isn't until Subaru is forced to hit the lowest of low points in his life that he's actually able to make any headway in his own personal struggles. It isn't until he's trying to give up on saving Amelia that he's finally able to see the light, and he can really find stable ground in the wake of everything that he's been through to that point. And later again, when he's about in the deepest despair of his life, struggling to overcome Roswell's manipulations, right before finally accepting that his life is worth more than just being thrown away. And it may not seem like much now, but the motivation change and the core problems that plagued the young man being gone definitely shine through in Arc 5. Rudius's changes, on the other hand, are far more noticeable. I mean, when you start off as a child prodigy sex pest and later grow up to be a mostly normal man with a wife and family who adores the people close to him, it's hard not to see the changes reflected outwardly. But here again, it is the low point forcing someone to make a decision and finally move past their flaws that drives home how someone can change from the hardships life presents. He gets beaten down by life over and over again, only to take each beating and carry away from it something that will change the shape of his life going forward. Yet, because he doesn't suffer some wildly disproportionate retribution for perving out at a young age, a lot of people aren't willing to look past it. And that begs the question, is punishment necessary for growth and redemption? Hardship certainly is, as I don't know any person who grew up in unchallenged affluence that turned out any less than a softie. But the idea that someone has to suffer to expunge their sins is something I don't find to be wholly reasonable. And I can get into that in a future video. Still, I admire the daring take on a protagonist whose flaws would generally render him an unlikable person in real life, growing up and becoming a much more controlled person. If you think Kid Rudy and Adult Rudy are exactly the same person, I have to wonder if you even experienced the same thing I did while watching this series. There are deeper fundamental things to be drawn out of each character, things that I truly do find worth a thought. In the case of Subaru, it's about the value of a life, about how even if you are insignificant compared to those around you, you can still be of value to them innately. And with Rudius, it's about how a simple second chance is all it takes for someone to turn their life around. We have to be willing to take that chance and face the hardships head on to overcome them. Caving to your own weaknesses and desiring things to be easy will get you nowhere. Flat characters generally aren't as moving or compelling in the same way. Not that they can't be done, I'm sure they can, but as I said, it's far easier to hook people with a shared struggle or the aspirational value of overcoming something to be a better person. You can pull off a flat character, but without something to really make your character feel like they've grown or changed, it may quickly become boring and people will lose interest. And not a lot of other characters actually reach the level of depth that these two that I've discussed do. And that largely contributes to these two series standing head and shoulders above the rest of the isekai genre for just how well they decide to handle these subjects. They're deep, complex, and very thoroughly constructed protagonists. That's why this whole project exists. That's why I wanted to talk about them. These two series have been ones that, no matter how many times I revisit them, the story continues to deepen and the level of impact their big moments have on me never change. That's the power of superb character writing. The power to be rich and fulfilling regardless of how frequently they are viewed, and not many stories achieve that in a manner similar to these.